In this exciting episode, $300,000 is missing. That's $2.5 million in today's coin. Sounds pretty fancy to me. It's Season 2, Episode 10 of Perry Mason, The Case of the Fancy Figures. Welcome to the Perry Pod. I'm your humble host, Jonathan Searcy, and my purpose here is pretty simple: provide an audio companion to the greatest legal drama in television history, Perry Mason. I plan to do a pod for every episode of the television series, and as time permits, I'll look at some of those made-for-TV movies too. I'll be working through the series in the order in which the episodes were aired. Each episode I'll give a brief refresher on the plot, and if the episode was based on a novel, I'll compare the book with its television adaptation. Next, I'll list some key pieces of trivia, as well as tackle the episode's main theme. We'll feature a Perry proverb, a moment of wisdom from the man himself, and then we'll finish with a post-case water cooler, where just like Perry, Della, and Paul, we can rehash the ins and outs of their adventures. But first, to the law library! Each episode in the law library, we return to prior cases to refresh our memories about Perry's past, so we can find fresh precedents for future cases. In this episode, Perry enlightens us about the distinction between slander and libel.
Yesterday, I received this in the mail. It contained $5,000 and a note asking that it be used as a defense fund for Martin Ellis. Both the note and the envelope were typed in your office.
Do you know I could sue you for libel?
Now, you're thinking of slander. And in any action for slander, truth is a valid defense.
Seems like Perry would know these laws backwards and forwards, since his falsely accused clients are always on the receiving end of some serious slander from the DA. You figure we'd encounter those civil torts more often. The only time I could recall either coming up is in the case of the Screaming Woman, where we encountered the libel queen herself, Mary Kay Davis, and her attorney Arthur Jarrick, whose whole shtick was keeping her out of hot water.
So my favorite client isn't satisfied with just slander and libel suits. Now she's stealing books.
A question: do you recall any other implicit cases of libel or slander in the show thus far? Without further ado, let's get to the plot of our episode. The Case of the Fancy Figures. Charles Brewster is a schnook. He's a partner in his father-in-law's firm, which manages business for Hollywood elites. Did I mention he's a schnook and stolen $300,000? Even worse, the schnook let another company employee go to jail for it, and Papa Jonathan Hyatt is upset.
I want you to look at these, Charles. It may explain a great deal.
Very interesting.
Is that your only comment? Do you realize that an innocent man was sentenced to 5 years in jail for a crime you committed?
The jury found Mr. Ellis guilty.
The jury was not in possession of the facts. These facts.
Yet, Papa Hyatt and son Richie don't call the police. Why? Brewster, it turns out, is married to Valerie. Valerie Brewster, née Hyatt. And she's got some problems.
Oh, Charles, I'm sorry. I wasn't feeling very well, and I thought maybe...
There's no need to apologize, Valerie. Everyone knows you're an alcoholic.
In this episode's casting recall, we've got Charles Brewster, who's played by the rich dude Mervyn Aldrich with the stolen gun from the case of the Restless Redhead. Martin Ellis's wife is played by Ann Barton, the defendant in the case of the silent partner. And as for troubled Valerie, yes, it's Karen from the case of the negligent nymph, where she played, you guessed it, a dipsomaniac with a husband who winds up dead. Well, Martin Ellis's wife, Carolyn, is the one who ends up with evidence that will exonerate her husband, so she calls up Perry.
Desmond Jewelers, account of Manning Bishop, 1 diamond solitaire, $8,500.
But that's one of the bills that disappeared.
Ellis, please take care of this. CB.
Now, that proves that Martin was telling the truth. But look at that. There must be 40 bills there.
And Perry turns to Hamilton Berger?
Of course, you understand, Perry, these will all have to be checked out.
Well, that shouldn't be too difficult.
No, it won't be. I'll give them to a handwriting expert tonight. I wish I could make an adequate apology for what seems to be a terrible miscarriage of justice.
Yeah, Martin Ellis is a free man, but he's upset about the injustice he suffered, and the justice he feels certain Charles Brewster will escape.
So it was a miscarriage of justice, and the district attorney is terribly sorry. Well, that's just dandy. But I sat here for a year and a half, and who cared? Nobody. Nobody but my wife. And I'm supposed to be happy because everybody says, tough luck, old man. Meanwhile, Brewster was out, having the time of his life.
Won't surprise you to know that Brewster gets arrested, tries to fly the coop, and ends up dead. Main suspect, Martin Ellis. And boy, is he bummed.
It's a funny thing, Mr. Mason. I've met you twice. Each time I've been behind bars.
But who else could it have been? Carolyn Ellis, or should I say, Carolyn Pulaski?
I have here a certified copy of her marriage license to Mr. Ellis. You'll note they were married on July 4th, 3 years ago. However, prior to that, she was married to a certain Victor H. Pulaski. 14 months before he died, she instituted proceedings for divorce against him. And this is a copy of her interlocutory decree. Now, under our statutes, the decree of divorce does not become final until a year has passed.
Well, Paul and Perry uncover some damning evidence against her in the Ellis apartment.
Wait a minute. Here's something funny.
Funny?
Check for $24 made out to the Barton Stationers.
And?
Well, they're in San Francisco. I know the store. Here.
But Carolyn has another suspect to verify her alibi. That would be the widow, Valerie Brewster.
Look, I can even describe the place to you. It's called Frankie's, and they've got about a half a dozen booths.
You could have been there many times. But is there anyone who can prove you were there at the time of the murder?
I can.
Valerie can.
Let's not overthink this, though. The obvious suspect was always Jonathan Hyatt, the man who discovered the body. And guess what? He did it. Perry explains the logic of the case to Paul in the denouement.
Your Honor, I killed Charles Brewster. My one regret is that Mr. Mason should have discovered it, that I did not come forward myself.
All right, simple enough. I've still got a question. Who was Brewster taking with him on his getaway trip? Remember the guy had 2 tickets? Didn't seem like it was going to be Valerie. Didn't seem like it was going to be Carolyn. Who was traveling with that guy? Was the second ticket for his ego? To be honest, there's a lot of questions. Maybe it's time we get trivial, shall we? Each episode in the trivia section, I give you 3 takeaways. Paul is a subject worth investigating more. Adela is something about a particular actor or actress in the episode. Perry is something we learn about our intrepid hero. Our Paul for this episode. There's an odd thing. When CBS released the DVD version of this episode, they left out a key minute of footage from Carolyn Ellis, or should I say Carolyn Pulaski's, initial visit to Perry's office. Now, the clip basically gave a description of what Hyatt, Brewster, and Hyatt as a firm did and how Martin Ellis got caught. Here's the bulk of the missing clip.
They do business management for some of the top names in Hollywood. people with incomes in the stratosphere. Each of the partners handles about a dozen accounts.
And the $300,000 that was embezzled,
Came from the clients of Charles Brewster.
how was the embezzlement managed?
Well, there were fraudulent bills submitted for various things like household furnishings, jewelry, things like that.
I take it these bills came from non-existent firms.
But my husband had no way of knowing that, and as comptroller of the organization, naturally, he paid them.
Naturally?
Well, each of the bills carried an authorization from Charles Brewster.
Just a side note, you might be wondering, if it wasn't on the DVD, how'd you get a hold of it? That would be the power of CBS All Access. Somebody let CBS know the version that's streaming on CBS All Access now has the rest of the clip. Also a fun note, the version of this episode that makes the rounds on MeTV or FETV also has it, even though the syndicated version of this episode is 6 minutes shorter than the actual runtime. So out of all the other material they cut, they didn't cut this one scene that in the full version they included in the DVD. And how did I know all this? It was in Jim Davidson's book, the Perry Mason book. So thanks to that book for letting me know there was more for me to find. Anywho, here's the Paul prompt. It should be easy enough to figure out what a controller's job is. I wouldn't have to ask my dad twice. So that we have a better sense of what it is Martin was supposed to do within the firm. But here's my question. Is he in any way responsible for not catching on that Brewster was authorizing $300,000 in fraudulent charges? Is Ellis somehow criminally or civilly liable for his unintended role in the fraud? Our Della this week concerns Frank Silvera, the murderer Jonathan Hyatt.
This is Jonathan Hyatt. No, Hyatt. Hyett.
Silvera might strike you as an odd casting choice. Silvera is certainly a rarity for Perry guest stars through 2 seasons of the show. No one else in the credits of Perry's shows through the first 49 or 50 episodes would have had news items about his divorce or performance as King Lee reported in Jet, the classic magazine reporting news, culture, and entertainment in the African American community. Silvera was born in Jamaica in 1914, his heritage including people of Latino and African ethnicity. He emigrated to America early in his life and began acting in a variety of roles that were more expansive than those typically given to African American actors. Accordingly, he was cast in guest roles as a Mexican rancher, the father of an African American student, or occasionally as a white businessman. His film roles include a part in Elia Kazan's Viva Zapata and also 1962's remake of Mutiny on the Bounty. More importantly, Silvera was a champion of African American actors and writers, and the Theater of Being he founded in Los Angeles in 1963 was dedicated in its methodology to showing the universality in humanity and getting African American actors and actresses expanded roles. You want a testimony to Silvera's legacy? In 1973, 4 prominent African American actors and producers, including a young Morgan Freeman, founded the Frank Silvera Writers Workshop based in the heart of Harlem. The people associated with the workshop read like a who's who of prominent African American screen legends. Playwright August Wilson, Ruby Dee, Kerry Washington among them. Our Perry this episode involves our intrepid hero's befuddling trust in Hamilton Berger.
Don't forget his father-in-law is Jonathan Hyatt.
Oh, that won't bother Mr. Berger. We've had our differences, but you can't accuse him of playing politics.
I'm a bit confused by this statement, Perry. Hamilton doesn't play politics? Why then does it seem like Hamilton does nothing about Jonathan Hyatt? the rich businessman who trashes a crime scene, steals evidence, and basically holds himself above the law. I mean, he had probably violated at least 2 or 3 laws even before Perry indicted him as the correct murderer. What other reason does Hamilton Berger have for not fully prosecuting Hyatt other than maybe he's a potential contributor to the DA campaign in a couple years in a way that Martin Ellis isn't? By the way, we've seen Berger do this before. We will see him do it again. Try to keep prominent personalities out of the courtroom. Seems to me like playing politics. I mean, the other bit of Perry insight here is that he's saying this to Martin Ellis in jail. Maybe he knows that every conversation inside the jail is being recorded, so we can all take it with a wink and a grin. I'm not really sure. I've just found this bit of insight from Perry into his frequent antagonist, Berger, a little bit befuddling. The theme for this episode is masochism. Valerie Brewster explains the concept to her brother Richie.
You don't know how I miss Charles. I wish I could figure out why. I guess I'm just a masochist at heart. Oh, we made such a wonderful team. He was such a terrible sadist.
Something's confusing here, too. Okay, it makes sense that if Valerie's a masochist, she would enjoy being with Charles, who tortures her. But it doesn't make sense that Charles would enjoy being with her. Part of a sadist thing is that they enjoy causing pain, right? So if a sadist knew that the victim was enjoying the pain, he probably wouldn't enjoy inflicting it in the same way, if that makes sense. And I'm just saying, this is the kind of messed up logic that permeates the entire episode. So wait a minute. It's better for Valerie, your daughter, if you don't do something about Charles, so you don't report him to the cops. But when he won't take her away with him, which seems like bad news, you turn around and kill him? So wait, you're Carolyn Ellis. You're going to get back at your cheating paramour by getting back together with the partner who wasn't good enough for you, who you cheated on in the first place and bamboozled and left in jail? The tortured and the torturers. Perry's got them by the truckloads. Now it's time for a Perry proverb. Perry saves the best for last in this episode, making a nice distinction between a cynic and a detective.
That's your trouble, Paul. You're a cynic. You keep looking for things that just aren't there.
Is that what you call a cynic?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, when a man looks for things that aren't there and finds them, then we call him a detective.
Given Perry's track record the past couple of cases, stumbling into murderers like Aaron Hubble and Luke Hickey when he thought the guilty party was somebody else means that Perry might be a detective too. And good for him, the world he occupies is enough to drive a man cynical. Keep your head up, Perry. The figures will begin to add up if you keep looking. And added up figures, well, that's about as fancy as figures can get. Now, let's grab a swig from the water cooler.
You know, there is one thing I don't understand.
Go on, Paul.
A research prompt from the last episode, the case of the Purple Woman, involved who might be an analog for Carl Van Houten or his forger, Aaron Hubble.
Well, in one of his letters, he mentioned a painting called The Purple Woman.
Oh, yes. That was painted in Arles in 1890 or 91. Van Houten gave the painting to the girl he used for his model. For some unknown reason, she wasn't happy with the portrait and kept it in the cellar. Then around 1895, I think it was, the place burned to the ground.
Myra Carraway and John Searcy both mentioned the Dutch painter Han van Meegeren, a possible analog for Hubble. John Searcy writes that when Van Meegeren's work was criticized as derivative, he decided to replicate the works of the world's greatest artists, including Vermeer. Amazingly, opinion polls in 1947 placed Van Meegeren as the second most popular of all Dutchmen, behind only the then Prime Minister. My dad, John Searcy, adds, "He forged no Van Houtens," which seems like a missed opportunity. John Searcy also discovered Amedeo Modigliani, an Italian painter and sculptor whose work was heavily forged. An exhibition in Genoa featuring 30 of Modigliani's works came under suspicion. It turned out 20 of the works on exhibition out of 30 were forgeries. And I wonder which Rufus Varner fell for that one. Here's another one. My dad, John Searcy, really did a deep dive this week. This one is fascinating. Enter Australian Impressionist Tom Roberts. A painting by Tom Roberts had been in unknown private hands until 2013, when it was listed by Bamford auctioneers in the UK for an estimated 60 to 100 pounds. Since then, it has had a dramatic provenance, as was revealed in an episode of the BBC art detective program Fake or Fortune. Spotted on a website by the former mayor of a town, Joe Natoli, who is himself a passionate art collector, he agreed with his wife Rosanna that he would bid up to 7,500 pounds on it in the auction. A painting signed by Roberts was a risk, as this dude was already well known as somebody who was forged. But they bought the painting, they brought it back to Australia, and their hopes of making a profit on it were dashed when a leading art expert said that there were no elements, brushwork, composition, nada, to relate it to Roberts' work of the period. The piece itself was titled Rejection. They kept looking. Scientific tests proved it was a late 19th century painting, a time when Roberts, who was the first Australian admitted to be in the Royal Academy of the Arts in the UK, was studying in Britain. Infrared technology showed an inscription and an address on the back of the painting that confirmed it was Roberts' address at the time. Original sketchbooks held at the Mitchell Library in Sydney showed a series of preparatory drawings that were very similar to the painting, but all of this evidence was still not enough. The final decision on authentication had to come from an expert. And then Mary Eagle of the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and a leading authority on Tom Roberts, found some of the painting exquisite, other parts not well painted. She thought it was indulgent. It was confessional, not what she expected from Roberts. But she concluded it was genuine, a pivotal early work by the father of Australian Impressionism. So it was initially listed for 60 to 100 pounds. Joe Natoli and his wife agreed to pay up to 7,500 pounds. How much do you think the puppy's worth? 200,000 pounds. Many thanks for those deep dives. Simply wonderful. As always, I'd love feedback about this particular episode or the podcast in general. Was there something about this episode you'd like to comment on, or something that you'd like to correct? You can leave comments on the pod's website at theperrypod.libsyn.com or email me at theperrypod@gmail.com. You'll find those links in the show notes. All Perry Pod episodes are available via Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes. Thanks again for joining me on this pod journey. Join us next time as Perry gets some help from the vocal talents of Mel Blanc. It's the case of the perjured parrot. Join me, won't you? Until then, this is Jonathan Searcy saying, keep on walking that Park Avenue beat.